prepared for you that's going to open up opportunities to think about photography as research, cultural production, forms of knowledge, and we'll see where the conversation takes us. It's been a pleasure to work with Dominic Campbell, who's a cultural producer and a serial creator of arts and health interventions, co-founder of Creative Aging International. He's kindly curated this session. And let's go to the next slide. I'll share with you a little bit about who you're going to be hearing from. So Dominic Campbell, you'll also be hearing from Barbara Heinzen, who lived in London for 30 years, working in long-range scenario planning with corporations and civil society around the world. She moved to upstate New York in 2011. Next, we have Ed Kashi, who's a photojournalist, filmmaker, and educator whose work has been published and exhibited worldwide. And we'll also be hearing from Johnny Miller, who's a photographer and drone journalist based in South Africa and the USA, working towards building more equitable futures. I'll remind everyone that this conversation is being recorded, and so you're welcome to keep your cameras off or on when we get into our conversation together. And without much further ado, I will pass this over to you, Barbara, to kick us off.
Trouble? Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Good. My speaker's giving me fits. Yeah, I'm Barbara Heinzen. I live in upstate New York, about 15 miles south of Albany, and I've been doing futures work for 40 years, having first started when I was finished my PhD at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London and was desperate for work. I met people in Shell's group planning department and told them, if you give me an assignment and you like it, you can give me a job. This ploy worked. I was quite desperate at the time. And I ended up creating this graphic because I had found some wonderful statistics from the UN that measured how social and economic indicators changed over time in developing countries. And what I learned from these numbers was that social development preceded economic development, which was not the customary wisdom at the time. And in fact, social development, as they measured it, was really health and education for most of the population, a majority of the population. Only once that social curve had reached what I'm calling here stage 3, did you see very rapid economic growth. And having been able to predict that, the Shell team said, this is fantastic. There are about 35 people listening to this paper. They said, now give it to our senior management. Just as a side note, I was especially interested in stage 1, the basic foundations, because I'd worked in Africa, and that's where it seemed most countries were stuck. So, come on, there we go. The management team, I was told, would think they're cleverer than anybody else, so double the information and do it in half the time. And that resulted in a new graph, because the countries you could see that had developed rapidly were small: Singapore, Taiwan, South Korea to a certain extent. But what happens when the populous nations start to move up that development curve and start to industrialize, and bigger populations demand more goods and more things? It struck me that we'd be putting such a burden on the natural resource base that we would be facing an ecological revolution. And we would need new social foundations, new skills, new knowledge, and new economic institutions in order to support the natural world, which, if we didn't support it, would destroy us. I never took my thinking further than that at the time, and my Shell colleagues after this remembered the first graph, but not the second one, for many years afterwards. In the early 1990s, I started working on the impact of HIV and AIDS in Africa, and that led me to give a talk in 1995 to a group from Anglo-American Corporation and to their scenario planners. What was clear by then, we were in an environment with habitat destruction, global warming, a microbial soup in oceans, chemical pollution on all sides, and rapid microbial evolution, which HIV was illustrating very dramatically at the time. Human populations were defended by a thin public health defensive line. As one person I read said, we are caught in the ecosystem. We are caught in the food chain, whether we like it or not. And someone else wrote, to a disease organism, the human population is the biggest meal in town. So that led me to think that human health needs ecological health. It wasn't enough just to whack enemy germs with whatever you could find. And we've been whacking them with all sorts of things for centuries now. We needed to think about the environmental health as part of our human health. As a sociologist in Tanzania said when I interviewed him, if the land is sickly, the people are sickly. Around the same time, I started working with Julia Roundtree, which is how I met Dominic. She was raising money for the London International Festival of Theatre and was tired of going around to businesses saying, please give me money, here's my begging bowl. She found it demeaning and it was pointless. She didn't like it. She wanted to change the relationship between arts and business, and I showed her the double S curve. Like me, she got interested in that first basic foundations period. She felt that that's where the arts could make an extremely important contribution because it was a safe space to explore difficult ideas and hard issues. The photograph on the lower right is of Julia and my former boss at Shell, Arie de Heers, engaged in one of the exercises that came out of the Business Arts Forum. At the same time, I was writing a book looking at that second curve. How might we invent a new social ecological system when there's no model to follow? And I started testing some of those ideas in talks to the Business Arts Forum. One of the more important graphs that came out of it was this one, this little graphic. It turned out that when I studied the early English history, the drivers of systemic invention were, first of all, extremity and necessity. Extremity of war, or the Black Death, or repeated plagues of some kind, and the necessity to find a new source of energy because wood fuel was running out in England. People began to experiment, and experimenting in question. And the idea of questioning as part of education was a major breakthrough at the time. I'm looking at, say, the 16th century, 17th century, before 1750. Many of these experiments took place in localities at the town level, where people engaged across lines of class and knowledge and skill. Aesthetics also had a role. If you think about Shakespeare's history plays, they were rehearsing, when is it okay to remove a king? 40 or 50 years later, King Charles lost his head. The symbol I used in the Business Arts Forum was Newton's windmill. As a boy, he was living in a village that had no access to coal and had begun to run out of wood fuel. Someone in the village found the plans for a windmill and had the education, maybe to write to colleagues in the Netherlands. Someone else was raising the money. The local carpenters contributed their skills, and people in the village were so fascinated by this windmill that they went out every weekend to watch its progress. Newton was so fascinated, he built a scale model of the windmill in his rooms as a student. So I like to say that Newtonian mechanics began as a neighborhood experiment. At the same time, in the late 90s, I started working with somebody called Arthur Muliro at the Society for International Development. He's Kenyan, and he was worried about the state of Kenya, which was about to blow up. He organized a group of about 20, 25 Kenyans, and together we created a process for thinking about the long-term future of Kenya. The work we did lasted 18 months and involved very intensive conversations about who are we, where are we going, what do we want? It was an emotionally charged exercise, but it was sufficiently successful that a Tanzanian who was working with, who was a member of the team, took that method and introduced it in Tanzania. So Arthur and I started working with him in Tanzania, and then we went on and did a similar exercise in Uganda, and then another one for the region as a whole. So over the course of 10 years, we were doing very serious, emotionally charged thinking about the long-range future of these countries. For the most part, I was the only non-African in the conversation. But I also began to get annoyed at this point because I'd been doing this scenario work for several decades, and it felt that all I ever did was talk, talk, talk. And I started thinking we have to do things differently. So I wanted to move from yak, yak to yakadoo, yakadoo, yakadoo. And what was very clear in East Africa was that this was an area of the world that was coping with extremes and dire necessity that needed a response that was not just the usual development answer. We needed to experiment it. We needed to use different ideas. And there was a lot of engagement across cultures, both within East Africa and between East Africa and the Western world. So working with my colleagues, the 5 people at the top of this set of photos, all of whom came out of the Scenarios projects, we created something called the Barbets Duet, which is an experiment in finding new ways to support people who support the natural world, so that we can both improve the state of nature and improve biodiversity and ecological health, while at the same time improving livelihoods. Everybody in this experiment contributed his own land and his own community as a learning site. Our first convention was held and hosted by the Seaweed Growers Cooperative in Lingotini, Tanzania, on the coast. And it was a very important meeting, and many of us are still working together now. At the end of the meeting, after everybody had showed their sites, they said, "Barbara, what is your site?" And I said, "Well, I don't have the kind of space that you do. My site is my front door in central London with my little plant pot garden." And I felt as though this was an unequal relationship, and that I was only, if I stayed as coordinating this group, I was only repeating the colonial and post-colonial relationships that had damaged Africa for a long time. So after my parents had passed away, I took their inheritance and I bought 19 acres on the Hudson River, relatively close to where my sister lives. The house was a disaster. Termites had eaten the foundations. The land was a disaster, overrun with invasive species. And I thought, let's see what I can do here. The house has now been rebuilt. It's getting a little shabby after 10 years. And I planted a native plant garden around the house. The swamp, we began a slow process of restoration because 3 working class hunters came to me and said, "We want to hunt on your property." And I said, "That's fine, but you have to give me land management in return." And that relationship, which is crossing an important class boundary in America, is still ongoing. And the slow restoration of the swamp can now be seen. So 2025, I bought the house when Obama was president, but now I'm living in Trump's America, which, as many of you know, is an utter disaster. I still think that we are facing the need to create an ecological revolution, and we don't have the faintest clue what we're doing. We have an even more damaged natural resource base, which means we're going to have crises over and over and over again, whether it's from epidemic disease, floods, droughts, fires, you name it, wars. We've got plenty of those. And we need more than ever to learn how to respond to extremity with experiment and new ideas and engaging across all the lines that separate us. In that, the arts is going to be incredibly important as a place to experiment with the things that we find most uncomfortable. And we also need the skills of our scenario planning exercises in East Africa. And they're demanding, but they're necessary, and they'll help us learn to think long-term about the whole population and create new effective institutions. For me, I'm retirement age. I don't want to do any more work, frankly. So I'm focused on the trout lily when I can get the time. And the trout lily, I didn't think existed here because I could see it around me, but it wasn't at my place. Now I see it all the time. It takes 7 years for a trout lily to bloom. One of the principles when we started the Barbets Duet has become a very important one. Don't wait for others to solve your problems. Just begin. And that's all I can say. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. The role of the arts in times of extremity. And I think we might see some threads carry through as we move over to Ed Kashi, photojournalist, filmmaker, and educator. Ed, I'll pass it over to you. You're muted, Ed.
There we go. All right. Welcome. And thank you, Nisha and Dominic, for inviting me. So we'll make a little bit of a pivot here. Barbara, thank you so much for that presentation. What I want to do in this session is share two bodies of work. One is work I did, Aging in America, that was an 8-year exploration of how America was growing old and kind of looking at the topography of an industrialized society as it ages. And then I want to share a group project that I'm currently working on with Ilvino Kitchen in Holland and Sarah Terry in LA. We're all part of the Seven Photo Foundation. And we've created over the last 2 years a project that is trying to look over the next 7 years at how the world is aging in an unprecedented way. And so let me start with the aging work in America. I'm a photojournalist and a filmmaker. I work especially with this project, in a sort of more traditional documentary form. We produced this work. I worked with my wife, Julie Winokur, who's a writer come filmmaker. And we went to 25 of the 50 states. We were really trying to look at, we did everything. This is Gloria Barnes. She's a model in Manhattan, the Senior Olympics. Like, what are we doing with this gift of longevity? On average, we are living 30 years longer than people 100 years ago. For some folks, it's a great extension of life. This is in Sturgis, South Dakota. We hung out with a group of a motorcycle gang called the Retreads, a couple in their 80s in Florida getting married. It was very important to not just show sort of however you put it, the sort of the downside or the difficult parts of growing older. We also wanted to show the vitality and how especially in the United States, where we do a very good job of destroying the fabric of family and community, but we also do a good job of reinventing. So this was in San Francisco, where we lived at the time, and in Chinatown, this organization Unlock developed an amazing program that enabled elders to live independently with the support of family and friends, and then their professional caregivers. Also looked at, the largest segment of the prison population, the fastest growing segment, which is elderly prisoners. So the idea was to look at, and there was a lot of frontline reporting. This is in San Francisco, where the sheriff's department realized that, every Wednesday, which was eviction day, they would sometimes show up to a place and there was an elderly person there, and they had no idea that they were about to be basically thrown out on the streets. So they came up with this innovative program where a social worker, the woman in the back, would come with the sheriffs when they knew there was an elder in the house to help them transition. But the takeaway for me, really, after 8 years of doing this, was that we are totally unprepared to care for people. And so we were looking at programs. This is in Washington, D.C. The VA had this innovative program, primary-based home care. For traditional cultures, this would seem maybe silly, or why do you have to do this? But again, this is how we are in the United States, the way we sort of destroy and then somehow rebuild at times. But it was a program similar to Unlock in San Francisco, where the VA would cobble together support through family and friends, and then the VA nurses. So this man was coming to care for his dad. Every day he would leave for his lunch break, wake his dad up, bathe him, dress him, and feed him, knowing that within a couple of hours a VA nurse would come to tend to her dad. Probably the most powerful story we encountered was in West Virginia. We wanted to look at rural hospice care, and we met these two gentlemen, Arden, who was 90, and Warren, who was 76. They met at a Walmart, and ultimately the younger man, who was 76, moved in to their farmhouse and cared for Arden and his wife. And this is the moment where Maxine, his wife, is dying. During the course of this project, I documented 4 death scenes, actually. But it was one of the most beautiful stories that we encountered. Again, this might seem cliche, but it's true when you sort of drill down in the United States past, the demagoguery of the politicians and media, and especially social media. You find that there are so many good people who are doing good things, who are taking care of each other. After we finished this project, then Julie and I realized her father, we were in San Francisco, he was living in New Jersey, was starting to show signs of dementia and Parkinson's disease. He was living alone. So we moved back to New Jersey to take care of him. And we moved Herbie into our home. This is my wife and our daughter. And this was between 2006 and 2008. And he spent the last 2 years of his life with us. We had a very quick learning curve of what it meant to care for an elder, because we were not prepared. But also at the same time, we received 2 commissions to do films and photo essays on the sandwich generation, which is exactly who we were, raising children and caring for an elder who was in need. And in the end, he died in our home with us around him. And it was, I will say that being a journalist made me a better human being, in terms of realizing when it came to my own personal situation, we had to come through for him, because without him, I wouldn't have the life that I had. All right, so now let's pivot to 1 in 6 by 2030. This is the project I was referring to. And I advised this with Ilvi and Sarah. And we have something like over 200 photographers in 40 countries who have contributed to this over the first 2 years of the project. 1 in 6 by 2030 refers to a statistic that by 2030, 1 in 6 humans will be over 60 years old for the first time in history. So we wanted to take this sort of global look. This is a picture by Ilvi in the Netherlands of her father doing, I can't believe she got this moment. Very sadly and tragically, he passed away, I think, in December. So we're all still in mourning about that. This is in India, Debshuta, a great Indian photographer. And also, one of the wonderful things about engaging in this project is, beyond whatever work myself and Ilvi and Sarah create, and it's all based locally. The idea is you should not need to get on an airplane. This is something you can walk or drive to, or take public transportation to do a story in your area. But we're given the opportunity to, and the privilege really, to bring the work of photographers that otherwise might not get this kind of exposure, bringing it to light. And so this is Deb's work on his aunties, about isolation and overcoming that, and the importance of family bonds. I'm going to go really briefly. I hope I do justice to this. This is in Indonesia. It was the photographer Ryan Andrews, who worked on this, was looking at the LGBT community there, and how they're supporting each other. This is my image. I ended up doing a story about a guy in New Jersey who loves sailing, and this is at a doctor's appointment. This is in Sun City, Arizona. Kendrick Brinson did this image. She did a long project, and she continues to work on it, looking at sort of the vitality of our elders in a retirement community. I think Sun City might have been the first one in the United States. This is in Brazil. Also looking at body positivity, and again, this idea that these people need to be seen and they need to be heard, and not just on the granular level, if you're so fortunate to have an elder with the experience and wisdom to learn from them, and also to share a life with them, but on the sort of societal level as well, that I feel these kinds of images, these kinds of stories need to be seen. And again, in the United States, I can only speak authoritatively about that. We have done such a good job of marginalizing our very young and our very old. And having had the privilege to work over in 100 countries in my career, I've witnessed the opposite of that, where communities and families hold together. This is in Vietnam. This is in New York City. This was a story by May Seva about this woman who in retirement became a dancer. And again, what we can learn, it's also inspirational. My gosh, I would assume we all hope we live a good long life and a healthy aging, not just living a long life, but a healthy life. And so many of these stories really are inspirational and show the possibilities of what we can do with this gift of longevity that we've been given through diet, modern medicine, maybe not the diet in the United States. Anyway, this is in Uganda, an elder gentleman who his family built this home for him so that he could. This is another very important thing, especially for our elders, just like for a child, is to make sure they have security, comfort, and can live in dignity. And it doesn't, you don't have to be rich to do that or to accomplish that. This is in Iran. This was a story about a man who was a horse trainer, and here is he's having he's at a lunch for his brother who is leaving to Saudi Arabia for the Hajj. And again, you know, this project, it enables us to also reflect not just on aging, and I there's probably a better word now for that, but our elders, but also the different sort of geographical and cultural ways that it manifests itself. This is in Boulder, Colorado. And this is in Maryland, a woman who is doing birding and helping to track and save bird populations in her area. And then the last three images, then I'll be finished here, is that our newest initiative is a portrait series on climate elders. And really excited and pleased to report that this work will be exhibited in Belém, Brazil in November as part of COP30. And so we tasked photographers, I think we've done in 20 different countries, this is in Brazil, to do a portrait of an elder in the environment where climate change has impacted them, and then ask them to offer, you know, words of wisdom, words of advice. This is in Zimbabwe. There's just something thrilling for me, you know, to engage with folks all over the world, photographers, and, you know, enable them to have their work shown. And this is in Lagos, Nigeria. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ed. These are really tremendous photos, and you can see in the chat the kind of engagement that they provoke. You know, I don't think there's much more that needs to be said really around how photography here is functioning as a catalyst, as forms of data, as evidence of knowledge in and of itself. And again, that thread of photography at the edges and at the extremes carries through right over into Johnny Miller's presentation. Johnny, I'll pass it to you now to remind everyone, Johnny is a photographer and drone journalist based in South Africa and the US, working towards building more equitable futures. Johnny.
Thanks, Nisha. Thanks, Ed. That was really inspiring. Really resonated with me as well. I'm going to present my work on primarily unequal scenes. It's a project that I started in 2016, looking at inequality around the world and using a drone to do that. But I'm also going to touch on my organization, African Drone. And we use drones, we use technology to help Africans tell stories and understand the world around them using technology. So I'll start with my presentation. I'll just get right into it. I'm American. I was born in, well, my family's from Michigan, but I was born in Maryland, but I was raised in Seattle. My father was a military person. But I moved to Cape Town when I was 30 years old and fell in love with the city. This is what the city looks like, the postcard view at least. And I thought, you know, I went there to study, to get a master's degree and to practice photography. And it sort of struck me as strange that this was the scene that people were showing through aerial imagery. And in my courses, I had learned that it was such a divided city, and the city infrastructure was set up to divide and disenfranchise people so effectively that it would be really interesting to start looking at this from above. Now, at the time, drones were kind of new. No one was really looking at this. Of course, there's data at the time. This is from the census. You could see very clearly how different racial groups in South Africa were divided. And it just so happened I was living in South Africa. This type of map is very similar in other parts of the world, including the US. But in this case, I was in Cape Town. It was a very divided place, but photographically, how could we see this? How could we really make people resonate? Or how could I make myself resonate with this topic? And so I went to a place called Masapumalele. It's near a beachy kind of wine farm area in Cape Town. You can see the green dots there represent Africans, Black Africans, Black South Africans, and the purple dots are white South Africans. The yellow dots are colored South Africans, and they all live separate lives. The township of Masapumalele has fences all the way around it, not to keep people in, but basically to prevent people from being able to see what's on the other side of the fence. It's much different than the surrounding neighborhoods, and on the ground, it's almost impossible to see what's going on. So I parked here, I put the drone into the air, it flew, and with my screen, this image came onto the screen. And I thought, this vantage of looking straight down at that division to me was something that I hadn't seen before. Drones allow you to look straight down. And before really drone technology took off, you couldn't do this with a helicopter very easily, except unless you had a really expensive gimbal mounted to the nose of a helicopter, you kind of had to lean out the side of the helicopter or an airplane. So every image was oblique. It was kind of looking towards the side, but the drone gave you this real top-down image. And I put this on my Facebook page, which had very few people that followed me at the time, and it went viral. So I woke up the next morning, and this idea that I had to look at inequality straight down in Cape Town resonated with people to such an extent that it just took off from someone with, I think, 200 people that followed my Facebook post or my Facebook page. Now there was 1,000 people that had shared this, 200 comments. I had messages in my inbox from journalists and from television stations, and everyone wanted to know, why was I the person to tell the story of inequality in South Africa? And very quickly realized after some soul searching that this was a calling. I think as a photographer, you always want to be known for a project. You always want to have your voice catch fire and other people to run with the project. And this was an opportunity that I saw, and very quickly went to other parts of Cape Town, because I realized that these divisions were everywhere in South Africa. This is just a little bit north of the city. There's about 1 million people that live in tin shacks just in Cape Town, which is a staggering number. And if you've ever been to the city, you'd realize how strange that is, because you only see that touristy side of things generally. There was huge wine farms that had tens of thousands of people living right next to them in tin shacks. You had also metaphors. You had areas of Cape Town where people had been forcibly removed that I looked at with the drone. And you can still see the footprint of their, where they used to live in the city streets there, right in the center of town in a place called District 6. I also went to Durban, which is the third biggest city in South Africa. This golf course is named after a famous Indian golfer who actually won the 1967 Natal Open, and he beat Gary Player, who was the best white golfer in South Africa. It was a big deal, but he couldn't get his trophy inside the clubhouse during a thunderstorm because it was a whites only clubhouse. So there's a famous photo of him getting his trophy outside in the pouring rain. And that photo provoked a lot of consternation in South Africa because of how it represented the country abroad. I mean, rightly so. So he's a pretty famous person representing the horrors of apartheid, and this golf course being named after him now has an informal settlement that has been taken over on part of it. So it's kind of an irony there. And then Johannesburg, of course, the largest city in South Africa, filled with disused gold mines, with illegal gold miners who still tunnel under the surface, dusty uranium-laden dust that blows into these informal settlements, and right next door, middle-class neighborhoods. In this case, a town called Primrose, and the informal settlement called Macaus. And in 2019, during the South African national elections, this made the cover of Time magazine with the title, "The World's Most Unequal Country." And that was kind of, in a way, the South African apex, I suppose, of these photographs, where it had gone from an idea of looking at data and looking at inequality from a drone that I had to becoming the representative image for a story that summed up 30 years after apartheid, the failures of the ANC government to rectify the inequality in the country. With that title, it was a little bit damning for the ANC, the ruling ANC party, which, by the way, has lost the majority vote in South Africa. So 7 years later, there's been a lot of cities that I've been to, a lot of countries that I've been to doing this project. And really, I look at things in a few different ways. I try to see the project, and I have right from the beginning in a 3-step process. So it is a political project. What I want to do is change people's behaviors. But as a photographer, I look at this 3-step process to get there, which is it interesting? And I think inadvertently I had hit on the perfect style of image for the social media generation, which was blocky, easy to understand, and colorful on a small screen. So I could stop people's attention for a moment and they could like or they could share it. And that top-down image became the defining aesthetic of the series. I have a whole lot of other images, not just looking top-down, but through working with photo editors and also just responding to, I don't know, feedback, but also my own feedback and my own intuition, the top-down, looking straight down on those divides has become the most interesting way to see inequality. Secondly, is it relevant? I think also as image makers, storytellers, you always want to create some sort of relevance in your audience. And there's something about seeing your house in the image. This was really the first time, looking straight down so you could see the rich side and the poor side next to each other. And this, by the way, takes a lot of research to find these locations. I think provoked in people, and you saw all those comments on my Facebook page, a feeling of indignation more than just pity. This isn't a project about poverty. This is a project about inequality. And that, in my mind, is a big difference. To a lot of people, that's a big difference. And when you can see yourself reflected in the rich side of the photo, then you want to share, you want to talk about it. It makes it relevant to you. And I think, because I believe that people want to change the state of affairs, especially in places like South Africa, you have to give them options. So you have to make it actionable. And that's why I'm so happy to be working with, for example, the Atlantic Fellowship, BMW Responsible Leaders, a whole bunch of organizations that are using my images and helping me come up with ideas and sharing options on my website and other things when I talk about this, to take steps to reduce inequality, not just alleviate poverty. Again, two different things. Through this, I've also, with help from Code for Africa, which is a non-governmental organization in South Africa, set up African Drone to help young Africans specifically to tell stories using drones, using technology. We have a lot of different things that we do, but essentially storytelling is at the core of all of these. You can find us at africandrone.org, but there's about 1,000 pilots in our network and many countries in Africa. That map is a little out of date. And some of the stuff that we've done has been really cool. Drones can't, they could do photo and video, but that's not all they can do. They can also create maps. So one of the things that we're doing is helping create maps in parts of Africa and around the world. I've worked a lot in Latin America also. For example, in Nairobi, in Kibera, which was the biggest slum area of Nairobi, the city government needed to build a road for a growing city, and they were going to build it right through the middle of Kibera without any public participation. And they eventually ended up doing it. They built this road. They bulldozed right through the middle of Kibera, and we were there, and we flew the drone and created a map that could accurately and in a dated way. So we put a timestamp on all of our photos, of course, and GPS location, create legal evidence also to create that map and show how many people had been displaced, how many schools were destroyed, how many clinics and churches and things like that had been destroyed. I've also documented hostels, which are a form of architecture in South Africa that are unique to South Africa. It's where miners used to have to live. Black miners used to have to be forced to live there. And there's 800,000 Black South Africans who still live in these apartheid era dormitory buildings. In Brazil, I've experimented with using 3D modeling. So traditional portraiture, traditional video interviews, but then also doing 3D modeling of locations as well, and then creating QR codes. So when we display the photos or the video, we can also display the QR code that pops up in augmented reality, so people can really engage in new, unique ways with storytelling. And then going back to places over time. You might remember this image, or you might have seen this image before. It's not mine, actually. It's my friend Tuca's in Sao Paulo, Brazil. A lot of people say this is the most famous image of inequality that's been taken. And we went back there 15 years later to photograph from a helicopter what it looks like now. And as you can see, the trees are bigger, but the divisions remain. So creating a body of work that's not just photos that provoke people, but also exists as a body of evidence, is what excites me and what I'm doing right now. This is my contact information, and African Drone is africandrone.org. Thanks for your time. I'm looking forward to the conversation afterwards.
Thank you so much, Johnny. Oh, there's so much to talk about already. I can see it unfold in the chat, but we are going to pass it on now to Dominic Campbell, who curated this extraordinary conversation for us today, but also is going to be contributing ideas on cultural production. I'll pass it over to you now, Dominic.
Thank you. So I'm going to dive straight in. Johnny, give me a wave if you can hear me. That would help. So I know the sound's working. Thank you very much. That's all good. That's the technical bit started. When Nisha asked me to put this together, I wanted to start a conversation or continue a conversation about things that we rarely get to talk about on these platforms. I wanted to talk about the art in arts and health, what it does, what its concerns are, how it works. In scientific or healthcare platforms, we're often not talking about a specific art form, we're talking more generally. So here, Ed and Johnny had a chance to talk specifically about photography. We're very rarely talking about the history of this work, the history of concerns that informs this work, which is what Barbara brought so beautifully, particularly those areas where the person, the place, the process, and the planet are intersecting. And how does creative work, arts and health work operate in those spaces? And when we do talk about the creative practice, often we're talking about in an arts and health space on a transitional practice rather than perhaps a transformational one. And I think that's damaging. I think it's limiting. I think we can do so much more. So what I'm going to try and do over the next 11 minutes is to use some of the work that I've done to illustrate some of these points and hopefully to encourage a conversation. So when I was about 20, this is how I made knowledge. I made knowledge by building carnival costumes in the Caribbean. That might seem like an awful long way from arts and health, and yet I don't think it is. The creation of a costume that allows you to be a king and queen, to step into the shoes of someone else, is an art form that has maintained people who were othered, who were dismissed, who were enslaved for hundreds of years. And at the same time as I was making knowledge from this type of practice, I was also learning from those artists surrounding me. And often they were artists that were involved in activism. They were gay men, they were LGBT communities who were threatened by HIV, by being ignored, by ignorance. And what I learned from them and the tools that they were using was that creativity is in of itself a knowledge-making practice, as I think Johnny and Ed have shown. As I got older, projects got bigger, they got more complicated. At my 30s, I found myself in charge of St. Patrick's Festival in Ireland. And St. Patrick's Festival in Ireland is usually evaluated by bums on seats, the number of people in attendance, how much they spend. But you can also articulate it and evaluate it as an exploration of belonging and identity, of an exploration of health and well-being. So processing, parading, as an Irish tradition began in New York. It began on Fifth Avenue, it began in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, with the displaced community coming together to make the point that it existed. And when I ran this festival in Ireland, what we did was we commissioned artists to work with kids from difficult postcodes. So they would dress as a king and a queen in a costume, and they'd walk down the street in the center of the capital, and we paid attention, be the center of attention. The whole event is about narrative. It's about the stories that we tell ourselves about ourselves, about those people from over there, and about parts of the city. And about who could be, in this case, Irish, who is included, who belongs. Celebration is a strategy. And I stayed with this idea for quite a long time. I began to develop a festival in Ireland called Bealtaine Festival, a celebration of creativity as we aged, concerned with the kind of things that Ed flagged up. And we could talk about this all day, but what's important for this conversation is its scale. It existed in doctor surgeries, in GP surgeries, in hospitals, in art centres, in high-end cultural venues, and in people's houses. There's lots of reports and you can read about it. But in each of those programmes, this is occurring quite often. An individual defined by their illness joins a creative programme and becomes redefined by the process of being Ron the singer rather than Ron the stroke patient. And I'm not the only person thinking this. If health is about adaptation and acceptance, then the arts might be more potent than anything that medicine has to offer, is a statement by Richard Smith in the British Medical Journal back in 2012, when he was looking for 0.1% of the NHS and the UK budget to be spent on arts, because arts is all about enabling narrative change for individuals and for systems. So to make the next point, I'm going to borrow from my friend Kunle Adewale, who does many pieces, but this makes one point really quickly. This is the occupational therapy department in Lagos, Nigeria, pre a visit from Kunle. How does it make you feel if you're a patient and this is the space into which you're going? This is it after a Kunle visit, painted with imagination. So before, afterwards. It is spaces all around the world of healthcare systems that talk to the people that use them about how important and how valued we find them. So the aesthetics of those spaces, in whatever country they're in, are continually contributing to people's sense of themselves. Artists are working with the senses towards healing, all 21 senses. And they're working with those things that affect our senses, whether we are visible, whether we belong, racism, sexism, ageism, with being heard or stigma. And when you scale this up to think about healthcare services and healthcare systems, something interesting happens. So this would be a traditional healthcare system. It's built on the idea that we firstly define an illness. We explain what that illness is in biological and scientific terms, and then we create a cure for the way that we define the illness, and then we create a system of care that builds around that definition. This is the way that a creative healthcare system might work, that individual creativity is a community catalyst which informs systems and processes and builds adaptability and resilience over time. The art making in this area is focused on creating the conditions for health. It's based on salutogenesis, the creation of conditions of health, rather than something like pathogenesis, creation of where illness comes from. And if we stay with that a little bit longer, it becomes, I think, incredibly relevant to the type of thing that Barbara talked about, that Johnny illustrated and Ed illustrated. We can improve the access to biomedical care, we can improve the care settings perhaps, but if it's in a community or a society that is in opposition either to those people in need of health, in need of care, or it stigmatizes the illness, then it's the society and its culture that is illness making. And so how do we address that issue? Well, in Dublin over the last 3 years, we've started to do that. We've been bringing artists and neuroscientists and activists. We've exhibited Johnny and Ed. We've had all sorts of different people coming into a conversation. And from those conversations are emerging new projects. If you want to know the full story of Creative Brain Week, you're just going to have to come here and experience it for yourself. In the last year, we managed to replicate that conversation in 6 places around the world very swiftly. And what's arising from that opportunity, the opportunity to talk to each other, is the observation that culture beats strategy. If we can shape the places in which those conversations take place so that they're equal exchanges between types of knowledge making, if we can think about how the creativity reshapes culture, we can end up working in different ways towards health benefits. So let me give you an example of that. At the moment in Argentina, which is how Nisha and I were together a few months ago, we're working on a project called Making a Way Out of No Way, where scientists and social teams started to ask about how could health be made in their communities? And the first thing that they did was an audit. What are the assets of our community? And they realized that one of the assets of their community is that there are lots and lots of young people. There are also guitar players, and there's puppet makers. And so healthcare professionals and researchers have been working with the musicians and the puppet makers to create opportunities for health education, brain health education, where children come, but they also bring their parents. And where, while you're learning guitar, you might also be learning something about prosociality. And we believe that this is a generational transformation program. So the healthcare system that we're building builds from children guitarists and puppeteers through researchers' health and educational expertise to the regional and national departments of health and internationally into apprentices and ambassadors. So health making, arts and health, it's a quantum process. It's about, at its best, I think, it's the most interesting and exciting, a transformational rather than a transactional process. It's trying to work everything all at once, all the time. My final set point. In 2020, the Irish Hospice Foundation, which is concerned with a good death, with how do we support individuals facing end of life, or people who are bereaved, or those institutions that support them, started an arts and health program. Irish Hospice Foundation is normally focused and involved on these kinds of issues. How many people are dying? How are they supported? What type of illness did they die from? And in the 4 and a bit years since this program began, we've done many, many, many projects with all sorts of artists, initially starting with engagement and then developing towards education programs, far too many than I have time to talk about in this call. But what we're learning is this, that if you create the opportunity using creative practice for people to explore the difficult things in their lives, they take that opportunity. What we are also learning is that death doesn't really fit into an acute healthcare system. Acute healthcare is predicated on the idea of fixing and mending. And if we believe that humans are organic, they don't fix, they don't mend. You won't leave cured, but you might leave healed. So, to try and put all of this together, and to summarize this logic of cultural production for arts and health, I might end by saying that creativity is in of itself a knowledge-making practice. At its best, it's transformational, though it can be transactional. It propagates rather than it scales. And because it works in an organic way, it is catalytic, resilient, and quantum. And perhaps if we have to reduce this to one line, we are activating kindness during our finite existences. I'd like to thank all those people and organizations and institutions who supported us to do this work. Those are my contact details. And let's see if we can have a conversation.
Thank you so much, Dominic. Catalytic and quantum and transformational are words I know I needed to hear in a period of some stuckness, as I live in New York as well, in a country at extremes. So I'm going to pass it over to my colleague, Niels Fiche, fellow co-director of the Jameel Arts and Health Lab and technical officer at the WHO Regional Office for Europe, who's going to be joining Dominic in moderating this conversation that we have a generous amount of time for. So over to you, Niels and Dominic. And keep your questions and comments coming, everyone.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dominic, and everybody who's just spoken so beautifully and presented such wonderful and inspiring images. It's really been a fantastic session. This is our opportunity to engage in a conversation. I know it's always a little bit difficult. You know, there's quite a few people on this call, and many don't know each other. But we do want to encourage you to speak. We want to hear other voices as well. Obviously, if you prefer to ask a question in the chat, then by all means do that, and we can integrate that into the conversation. But if you feel the courage and the need to put your hand up, please do so. We'd love to hear from you. I'd like to start. Oh, I see a hand already. Was that a hand? Was that a real hand? Yes. Dahlia.
But you go ahead, Niels. I think.
No, not at all, not at all. I insist. I just want to urge everybody though. That was very random that I managed to see you actually put your hand up. So I would need you to put your hand up, ideally using the react button. So down at the bottom, there's a react button, and then you can put up a virtual hand, and I'll be more likely to see that. But Dahlia, please go ahead.
Well, thank you, and to both Nisha, Niels, and everybody, thank you so much for bringing this conversation. It is so needed, and we're creating this community, I think, of like-minded people that really can learn from each other, and I think it's very exciting. There are so many things that have happened over this last 20 minutes to 40 minutes that have been so inspiring and have evoked so much emotion and conversation in my mind already. But a couple of themes I just want to point out is that I'm so appreciating, as a physician, hearing, what these points are at end of life or these marginalized communities, seeing that in the arts, because it is hard to express. And I want to encourage whoever said that doctors should see this. I'm seeing this, and I would like to bring it into mainstream a lot more because it is very, very important. And those end of life pictures were so beautiful. And I think about geriatrics practices and populations that we only see in the hospitals and gowns, and kind of dehumanize who they are as people is just so rewarding in terms of seeing your photographs. And also the disparities, it kind of feels like everything you guys are talking about are like the kinds of things that I see in my work, but can't ever visualize or show from that 30,000-foot lens. And Johnny, so I was wondering, for your work specifically, did you get any backlash from people that wanted to keep those parameters the way they were in terms of your representation of those disparities and discrepancies in society?
That's a good question. I've been mystified over the last 7 years of doing this project, how little backlash I've gotten. And I think it's because I'm showing both sides. You're able to defend both sides of arguments by showing both sides of the participants in the problem. So let's call them left-wingers, have a particular agenda that they can push using my photos, and the right-wingers have the same agenda that they can push using my photos. And I don't really feel comfortable going into that in this conversation, but I think you know what I'm referring to and implying. In the South African context, there was a moment where I thought, because of the fact that it was on the cover of Time magazine and kind of needling the country, I mean, not kind of, it was really pushing this notion that the ANC had failed Black South Africans by keeping millions in poverty living in tin shacks. Weeks later, I got a commission by the South African government to have my photos at one of the COP events. So it's strange. I think if I were photographing people on the ground, it would have been a different response. I think the aerial imaging triggers some sort of psychology in people that removes the people from the problem. And I think there's a lot to talk about there, and I don't want to get into it right now, but there's a lot of psychology in aerial photographs that is part of the reason I think that they're accepted by almost everyone.
Thanks, Johnny, and thanks for the question, Dahlia. I can't see anyone else put their hand up right now. So I'm going to go ahead and ask a question to all three of our speakers. Well, we had 4 speakers, so Dominic, please feel free to join this conversation to answer this question as well. But it was specifically because you were giving kind of presentations that I feel each of you had a moment where you chanced upon something, or you found something, or you portrayed something that resonated with your audience very, very strongly, and produced a kind of catalytic effect. Johnny, you very specifically mentioned that one picture that you put out, which then went viral. And I'm just kind of wondering if each of you can say something about the kind of predictability or the unpredictability of these kinds of moments. So I mean, on the one hand, I think, Johnny, you were kind of saying it's it was entirely unpredictable, or it seemed entirely unpredictable. But on the other hand, maybe there was something that led up to this moment. Maybe there's something about the creative process that sparked that viral image, and perhaps our other speakers have some kind of insights about how those moments come about and how one capitalizes on them. So, Johnny, maybe I can go to you first, and then Barbara and Ed and Dominic as well, if you have any thoughts about that. Johnny?
Okay, let me start with an anecdote. There was a director of photography for National Geographic named Sarah Lean. I'm sure Ed knows her. She's very famous in the field. And when she saw my images the first time in 2017, I brought her a portfolio of my images. It was a portfolio review, which means a photographer shows his images to a photo editor and they give you feedback essentially. And if it's good, they might decide to publish your images. So I was pretty excited. And I stacked my portfolio with a lot of aerial images, even the ones looking off to the side. You can imagine in an airplane, taking a photo out the window of an airplane, you kind of see the horizon. That's what I mean by that side image. And she is a no nonsense woman. And she basically said, get those out of here. She's like, other people have taken those photos and they've taken them better than you. But she said, I've never seen anyone looking straight down on these divisions before. And these are the images that we want to run in the magazine. And that to me was a real moment, from a real professional, where I realized that the power, and that's why I'm saying, that 3-step process, the power in making something interesting is a science in part. And I think novelty is a big part of that science. You have to have balance. You have to have a balance of color and black and white. You have to have pattern. You have to have form. These are all things that photographers work with as our medium. But then novelty beyond that, I think, goes a long way. And there's some sort of novelty, some sort of impressionistic activity that happens when you are confronted with those divisions that helps it go viral. So I maybe I misspoke or you misheard me, but I don't think it's completely impossible to not predict what will go viral. I think you can predict to some extent based on some constituent parts what things have a better chance of going viral and catching people's attention. But of course, luck takes the rest. The rest of the part of how it goes viral is due to that one person sharing your image and having a node type relationship in the social media ecosystem that allows other people to share it.
Thanks, thanks, Johnny. I think, yeah, I probably overemphasized the kind of randomness of it, but the purpose of the question was really to dissect a little bit the kind of zeitgeist element of what's happening here, and whether one can predict that, and to what degree one can. Barbara, I was going to ask you that the same question, not because you were kind of presenting an image, but or an artistic kind of presentation, but I believe you kind of had that same moment with your early analytical findings and the curve that you presented. Do you have any sense about the kind of predictability of impact, as it were?
I had no sense of the impact of that one. I was intrigued by it because I had worked with an aid agency. I didn't much like the development project, and I hated development theory. So when Shell said, predict the next newly industrializing countries, I got these statistics and I found myself in the position of creating a development theory, which was the last thing I wanted to do, because the numbers were very plain and they were very, very helpful. But in thinking about the process of thinking in a different way about things, when I started writing my book about how might we invent an ecological society, I couldn't figure out where do I begin, because I couldn't write it academically. There's no way to prove whatever ideas I was coming up with. But I did find myself writing a sentence to the effect of, everybody has his way of looking at the world, this is mine. And what it was, and what I went on to say, that it was about seeing something that I couldn't quite understand. And the best example of that was my room as a student in central London was in a very old house, and the fireplace was tiny. And as an American, I grew up with big wood-burning fireplaces. So why were these fireplaces in London so tiny? And it actually had to do with a whole set of things. That just asking that question led into a whole lot of information about how the energy transition took place in early England. Because why were the fireplaces so different? Right? So I would begin with a question that was based on something I'd seen or noticed or heard. And then that question would led into other questions and so forth. And I think then the other thing about the when Shell said predict newly industrializing countries, that was coming from a corporate perspective. I was coming from an academic perspective, and these cultures are often in collision. And I was kind of, I was ambivalent about the role of business, but not completely opposed to it. What could they do that the development agencies hadn't done? So it's this collision of different ways of looking at the world that was also extremely important to finding something that was different. So all our scenario projects, we tried to engineer as many collisions as we could in order to foster creativity. If that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think particularly the final bit of what you just said, in order to foster creativity, I think that part of the kind of research process, I think, is just so often overlooked or undervalued.
Yeah.
Ed, do you have any examples of kind of catalytic moments in your creative career?
Yeah, so it's interesting, because up until the last 10 years or so, where now I've become more of an advocacy journalist because I want to have impact. I don't only want to raise awareness, although there's nothing wrong with that. That's still a good achievement. Especially with the aging project and then the sandwich generation work. This work has now been used in university level for geriatrics, social work, and nursing schools. So, to me, as a media maker, where I never imagined that would mean anything because I wanted to be on the cover of whatever National Geographic, to me, in some ways, that's become a deeper form of impact, because it means that, this kind of work, which again is a more of a traditional work in that it's reality based, real people in real time, in real moments. It's not conceptual and it's not directed. There is an impact to that. And I think people still have a hunger for that, and we can have impact. So, and then a few years ago, actually before the pandemic, I was invited to Harvard to speak to a group of doctors and nurses. And I just remember thinking, like, what the hell am I here doing? Like, I was so nervous. But again, after the presentation, it reinforced the efficacy and importance of this kind of documentary work, in that professionals in these fields, like the work we're doing brings the situations they're in to life. And there's a way that we can impact people out there as well. I know one of the projects I did with Julie on a woman who had breast cancer in Dallas. It was in the New York Times Magazine. Within a month, she received $50,000 of donations. So there are ways that, even in what I perceive as somewhat cynical and now extraordinarily polarized world or society, we can still reach people and have impact. So, and some of this is also with aging, and again, I'm so sorry to keep on using that term. If anyone has a better term, let me know. It's universal. It's not everybody can relate to, the Taliban or whatever, the war in Iraq, but everyone can relate to growing old or being around that situation. So anyway, for me, I feel like I've had multiple examples from the granular level to like the larger scale level where this work can have impact and has meaning.
I'd like to add on to Ed and respond to Niels and link in Barbara and Johnny if I can manage it. So firstly, Ed, I think aging is a fantastic word and should be embraced. And we should celebrate it, partly because the alternative is not so hot. Right. Like, I want to age as long as I possibly can, and I want to reclaim that word, and I want to, do all that good stuff.
As Mick Jagger said, what's the alternative?
Mick Jagger, whose next tour is currently sponsored by the American Association of Retired People. Things change, Extraordinary changes are happening all the time. I think so in the middle of these conversations, I think there's something really interesting about the role of the imagination. So the role of the imagination and visualizing something. So I am, I work with people who work for health outcomes in places where believing that a health outcome is possible is an imaginative act akin to delusion. Okay, it's a ridiculous idea that this is possible. But you've got to imagine it's possible before you can actually start on it, before you can get to the point that Barbara ended her talk with, just start. And so I think that the proliferation of that's why I think this work actually doesn't scale, it proliferates. It proliferates like vegetables do or like flowers do. People catch inspiration and off they go. And one of the aha moments for me was talking with Barbara and talking with a colleague involved in looking at the same festival at the same time, Shirley Grace Heath, which was about how you measure education and what that looks like. And she said, somebody said, and I can't remember who it was. They said you measure it by in language. And the first language, the baseline is, and the success moment is what if. And so you go from to what if. And that journey is extraordinary. And that journey is the beginning of people going, what do we do next? How do I get started? And that, I think, is fundamental to this work. That, we can measure the impact of dance on heart and lungs. We can measure prosociality. We can measure the degenerative pace of a neurodegenerative condition if it's affected by painting and singing. That's all great. But I think at the heart of this is how do we encourage people to be inspired, for their imagination to see new possibility, and for them to be brave. And I would like to thank Ed and Barbara and Johnny, because their work makes me brave. And I'll hand back to Nisha.
Thank you so much, Dominic and Johnny and Barbara and Ed. And thank you, Niels, as well, for being in, for facilitating this conversation. And I'm really just left with more questions and queries and curiosity. And that's a good place to put a resting point with curiosity. Quantum creativity. So Tessa has put some links in the chat so that you can stay in touch with us, and we'll be sharing a link to this full conversation should you wish to revisit it or share it again. Our next conversation is on April 18th, same time, same place, and it'll focus on the arts and social prescribing, or arts on prescription. And for now, we're going to share with you also a link to a bit of an opportunity to offer a bit of feedback on this conversation and to share your ideas about what else we might explore together. So I think this is where we'll bring it to a close. Again, thank you everyone for being here, and wishing you a very beautiful and creative and curious day. Thank you.
Thank you.